Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder if your baby is getting enough language input and where it is coming from? Well, this new study dives deep into just that, looking beyond just what mom and dad say. So, we all know that hearing words is super important for babies to learn how to talk. Most of the time when scientists study this, they only listen to what grown-ups say to babies. But here is the thing, most families have older kids, siblings who are also talking. And in the US, get this, 80% of kids live in households with other children. Meaning there is a good chance your baby isn't just hearing adult talk. This study asks a really important question. Can we measure how much speech babies hear from other children, and what is that speech even like? The researchers thought, hey, if adult talk influences how babies learn, then talk from older siblings or other kids must play a role too. They noticed that studies often show differences in language development for babies who have older siblings. For example, later-born children might develop language a bit slower, while some of that might be due to parents having less time for each child. Another big piece of the puzzle could be the constant chatter from those older kids. So the goal here was to really quantify this other child speech, how often it happens, how much there is, and what it actually sounds like. To figure this out, the researchers used special day-long recordings of babies who had older siblings. They were able to identify segments of the recording where other children were speaking. Think of it like a really detailed audio diary of a baby's day. They listened to these recordings and specifically looked for times when other kids were talking. Then, they transcribed these moments and compared them to adult speech from the same recordings. They wanted to see if the speech from children was different from adult speech in a few key ways. They looked at a few different things. First, the frequency of other child speech, basically how often it pops up. Then the quantity, how many words are being said by these other kids compared to adults. And finally, the content of the speech. This is where it gets really interesting. They examined things like how repetitive the speech was, how long the sentences were, how common the words were, how easy they were to learn, and even if the words sounded like what they meant, like onomatopoeia such as moo or vroom. So, what did they find? First off, other child speech is really common. It showed up on average every 46 seconds. That is about once a minute, which is pretty frequent when you think about a baby's day. Adult speech, as expected, was more frequent, happening every 19 seconds on average. But still, that means that for babies with older siblings, speech from other children is a consistent part of their sound environment. In terms of how many words babies hear in the segments where other children talk the most, babies heard about 889 words from them over a 45-minute period. This sounds like a lot, but adult speech in those same high child talk times was still more. Around 1319 words. However, when they looked at times with the most adult speech, babies heard way more adult words, around 3,200 words in 45 minutes. So, while there are times when kids get as much speech from other children as from adults, overall adult speech still forms a larger chunk of the baby's input. But the study points out that during those child-heavy moments, other child speech is providing a substantial amount of language. Now, for the content, which is where we see some clear differences. They looked at something called type token ratio, or TTR, which basically measures how repetitive the speech is. A lower TTR means more repetition, and a higher TTR means more different words are used. They found that speech from other children had a lower TTR, meaning it was more repetitive than adult speech. This might actually be good for babies, as repetition is key in early language learning. They also measured mean length of utterance, or MLU, which is just the average number of morphemes or parts of words in a sentence, a way to gauge sentence complexity. Unsurprisingly, adult speech was more complex, with longer MLUs. Other child speech had shorter utterances. This makes sense, given that older siblings were on average around 5.5 years old, still developing their own language. But the study notes that these shorter utterances from kids still fall within the range of what adults might say to very young children. So it might not be totally different from what babies are used to hearing from adults. They looked at how often words were used. Interestingly, the average word frequency didn't differ much between children and adults. This was a bit unexpected because you might think kids would use more common words. However, they did find a difference in the age at which these words are typically learned. Words used by other children had an earlier average age of acquisition. This means kids tend to use words that are learned earlier in life, which makes sense as they are still building their own vocabulary. Iconicity is about how much a word sound resembles its meaning, like animal sounds. Interestingly, there wasn't a significant difference in iconicity between child and adult speech in this study. Finally, they looked at the types of words. They found that other child speech had a higher proportion of nouns compared to adult speech. This aligns with research showing that young children's vocabularies often have a bias towards nouns. So, what's the big takeaway from all this? First, speech from other children is a really common and significant part of the language environment for babies who have older siblings, happening about once a minute. While it is not as much total words as adult speech, there are times when the sheer volume of words coming from kids is substantial, almost making up for potentially less adult talk in certain situations. The findings about the content of this speech are also super interesting. The increased repetition in other child speech might be especially helpful for very young babies. Even though adult speech is more complex, the words used by children are earlier learned, and there is a higher proportion of nouns, which could make this input quite accessible for infants. It suggests that this sibling speech might be, in some ways, perfectly tuned for early language learning, even if it is not as grammatically complex as adult speech. Now, like all studies, this one has some limitations. The researchers focused on specific high child talk moments to capture enough data from kids. This means they might have missed some everyday interactions. Also, they didn't always know for sure if the speech was directed at the baby, an adult, or another child. And the sample size was relatively small, which is common in this type of detailed audio analysis. What does all this mean for us? It means we really need to think beyond just parent-child interactions when we discuss early language development. For families with multiple children, the voices of older siblings and other kids are a constant source of language exposure. This isn't just background noise, it is a potentially valuable learning opportunity for the baby. The fact that this other child speech often features simpler structures, more repetition, and words that are easier to learn suggests it could be a particularly effective way for infants to pick up language in those crucial early stages. It really highlights the importance of considering the whole linguistic ecosystem a baby lives in, not just the adult-child dyad. Future research will definitely need to explore how this other child speech directly impacts a baby's language development. Does hearing more repetitive speech from a sibling lead to faster vocabulary growth? Does the type of words used by older siblings predict what the younger sibling will learn? These are some exciting questions that are now on the table overall. This study paints a richer picture of the language environment many babies experience, emphasizing that the diverse voices around them, especially those of other children, play a significant role in their journey to speaking. So what are your thoughts on this? Do you notice your little ones interacting with older kids differently? Let me know in the comments below, and if you found this fascinating, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with other parents and educators, and don't forget to subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more deep dives into the science of the mind. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.